Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. She was 8 months pregnant, a shotgun blast to the head, no signs of forced entry, and her husband? Calm. Too calm. In towns like Katy, Texas, crimes like these don't just shock, they haunt. This is the real-life unraveling of a murder that tore through layers of a seemingly perfect suburban family. We're not here to tell a story. We're here to follow the blood trail of truth. January 11th, 1999. Suburban Texas. The kind of neighborhood where neighbors mow their lawns on Saturdays, Christmas lights stay up too long, and people wave even if they don't like you. That afternoon, just past 3 p.m., local teachers and students were settling into the rhythm of the week. But inside a modest brick home on Cedar Falls Drive, the scene was already beyond repair. 30-year-old Belinda Temple was found dead in the master bedroom closet. A single shotgun blast to the rear of the skull. Contact wound. No defensive injuries. No blood spatter patterns suggesting movement. It was a clean execution-style kill. Crime scene techs logged the following within the first 45 minutes. No sign of forced entry on the front or garage doors. Back door glass shattered inward. Glass fragments atop kitchen rugs. Jewelry box untouched. Wallet still on the kitchen counter. Thermostat set to 68 degrees. No open windows. No signs of struggle. Belinda's body was partially slumped against the far wall of the closet. She was dressed in maternity jeans and a school-branded sweatshirt. Her wristwatch had stopped ticking at 3:24 p.m. Investigators assumed the battery had jarred loose on impact, but it soon became more significant than that. The only other person home earlier that day had been her husband, David Temple, a high school football coach with a steady record and no criminal history. According to his initial statement, he'd taken their 3-year-old son, Evan, out for errands and returned to find his wife unresponsive. He dialed 911 from the home landline at 4:11 p.m. First responders noted David's demeanor: lucid, articulate, dry-eyed. "It looks like a break-in," he reportedly said. "Somebody must have been watching the house." But the crime scene didn't cooperate. The broken glass from the back door was on top of a doormat with no footprints. No debris from outside had been tracked in. The kitchen floor showed vacuum lines, undisturbed except by first responders. Forensic techs began documenting potential staging indicators. Detective Robert Tonnett, who arrived on scene shortly after 4:30, later summarized it this way: "The house didn't feel broken into. It felt broken apart surgically." By 6 p.m., the Harris County Sheriff's Office had sealed the perimeter. Neighbors were canvassed. One reported hearing a loud bang around 3:25, but chalked it up to a car backfiring. Another neighbor mentioned seeing David Temple's SUV leaving the house around 3:45 p.m. That timing would become critical. The autopsy began the next morning. The report was direct. Cause of death: gunshot wound to the head. Manner: homicide. Weapon: shotgun, 12 gauge, contact range. Additional findings: viable female fetus, approximately 8 months gestational age. The fetus had not been injured directly but died within minutes of the mother's death due to lack of oxygen. The coroner listed 2 victims. What made the situation more unsettling was that no one could identify a motive. Belinda had no known enemies, no pending lawsuits. She wasn't involved in anything criminal or suspicious. She taught special education, volunteered on weekends, and was preparing a nursery for their second child. And yet there was something about the way she'd been killed, precise, planned, unflinching, that contradicted the randomness of a break-in. Police photographed the closet. The scene felt oddly clean for a shotgun homicide. There was minimal high-velocity spatter. The positioning of the body suggested she was either lured or cornered. There was no sign she'd tried to run. By the 3rd day, the focus of the investigation subtly shifted from the exterior to the interior of the home. Not just physically, but relationally. Detectives pulled David's phone records. They began collecting logs from the school where both David and Belinda worked. They requested surveillance footage from nearby traffic intersections, hoping to account for his movements. And in the meantime, one question grew louder inside the unit. Where was the murder weapon? The Temple household had no registered firearm, but Belinda's father recalled David once storing a shotgun for hunting trips. That weapon was missing. It was never recovered. Searches of nearby drainage ditches, fields, and construction sites yielded nothing. Without the gun, prosecutors would need a case built entirely on circumstantial evidence and forensic anomalies. 2 days after the murder, investigators re-entered the home with an evidence vacuum team and luminol sweeps. They identified trace amounts of gunshot residue in the master closet, consistent with the blast, and faint patterns of cleaning solution near the kitchen sink. But no fingerprints other than family and first responders were recovered from the back door or surrounding surfaces. Detective Tonnett made an entry in his case file dated January 14, 1999. It's too clean. No tool marks, no forced drawers, no messy exit. Even burglars leave messes. Whoever did this knew what not to leave behind. By week's end, media outlets picked up the story. The headlines focused on the tragedy. A pregnant woman murdered in her home, baby girl lost, husband heartbroken. Local news stations aired candlelight vigils and interviews with co-workers. But quietly, behind the scenes, Harris County investigators began asking different questions. What was David Temple doing between 3:20 and 4:10 p.m.? Why had he waited nearly 50 minutes before calling 911? Why was there no visible grief? And why did his answers feel rehearsed? By the time crime scene technicians logged the last photograph of the master bedroom closet, the victim's name had already begun circulating on news wires across Harris County. Belinda Lucas Temple, 30 years old, special education teacher, wife, 8 months pregnant, a woman not just lost to violence, but erased by it. The preliminary autopsy results had established time of death between 3:20 and 3:30 p.m. The fetus, a viable female near full term, had died from lack of oxygen within minutes. The medical examiner labeled both deaths as homicides, no defensive wounds, no signs of sexual assault, no struggle, one blast, point blank, done. As standard procedure, investigators turned next to build a complete victimology: who Belinda was, what her daily life looked like, and whether anything in her background could inform a motive or narrow a suspect pool. Her employment records showed consistency. She had worked as a special education teacher at Katy High School since 1996. Colleagues described her as punctual, disciplined, rarely absent. She kept a small photograph of her son Evan on her desk and always brought homemade lunches. No HR complaints, no disciplinary actions. She was respected by administration and deeply liked by students. Detectives interviewed co-workers within 72 hours of the murder. One teacher recalled Belinda seeming tense the Friday before her death. Another mentioned she had asked to borrow a pregnancy cushion from the nurse's office for additional back support, indicating the strain of carrying a near-term child while teaching full days. What stood out wasn't what Belinda said, but what she didn't. She hadn't shared much about her home life. She avoided faculty gossip and left promptly after work. Several co-workers noted that she never joined group lunches. One paraprofessional recalled, "She always smiled, but it didn't go to her eyes." Forensic psychologists later reviewed this pattern in victim behavior as potentially indicative of emotional isolation. Not a red flag for imminent danger, but consistent with victims in controlling or high-stress domestic dynamics. Her calendar, recovered from her desk drawer, showed a series of routine entries: parent-teacher conferences, OB/GYN checkups, lesson planning blocks. Notably, an entry on the day of the murder read the 3:15 home, rest, final sort nursery. A baby shower had been planned for the upcoming weekend. At the Temple residence, investigators processed Belinda's personal effects. Her purse was upright on the counter, contents untouched. Her car keys were on the table. Her phone's last outgoing call had been made at 2:58 p.m., a voicemail to a fellow teacher. "Just confirming Saturday. Can't wait to see everyone." There were no incoming calls afterward. The call was time-stamped and preserved. Digital forensics noted no activity on her email account after 3 p.m. Her personal laptop, powered off and still in her work bag, had not been accessed that afternoon. There was no search history suggesting threats, legal concerns, or intent to leave. Everything pointed to routine. In her OB/GYN file, filed under Harris Women's Clinic, the last ultrasound, dated January 4th, confirmed a healthy fetus. Notes from the attending physician included patient emotionally stable, mild stress noted due to work fatigue, support system present. Detectives pressed gently into that final note. Support system present. Who had the doctor referred to? Friends, family, spouse? Belinda's family, her parents Tom and Carol Lucas, were interviewed on day 4. They confirmed regular phone contact with their daughter. She had spoken to her mother that Sunday, January 10th, about nursery paint colors and a delivery mix-up with a baby bassinet. There was no indication of fear, no mention of conflict. But in that same conversation, Carol recalled something odd. She said she was tired, the mother stated, said she'd been sleeping on the couch lately. Something about the mattress being too stiff, but we know she had a pregnancy mattress topper. Detectives flagged the detail. Forensic sweep teams returned to the home the next day. The living room couch had a fleece throw neatly folded at the end. Underneath, a pillowcase stained faint yellow was found. No blood, no DNA, but the pattern, sleeping separate, was consistent with relational distance. Not proof of motive, but a shift in proximity, physical and otherwise. School district records revealed another minor but curious data point. Belinda had submitted an internal transfer request 2 months earlier, October 1998, to move from Katy High School to a neighboring district. No reason cited. The request was withdrawn after 2 weeks. Investigators cataloged this too. By the end of the first week, the profile of Belinda Temple was fully constructed. A woman with no enemies, a respected educator, no mental health history, no financial stressors, no substance use, no extramarital involvement, socially reserved, relationally private. She was, as one officer phrased it, a clean read, which meant something else would have to be dirty. The forensic team mapped out her final movements based on physical evidence and timing. 3:05 p.m. Arrives home from school, parked her SUV in the driveway. 3:10 p.m. Enters through garage, drops school bag inside kitchen. 3:12 p.m. Phone placed on counter, no further activity. 3:30 p.m. Shot fired, close range, left side entry. 3:24 p.m. Her wristwatch stops. No struggle, no call for help. Everything stopped at that timestamp. And as investigators reviewed each element, calendar, digital traces, physical layout, one thought started to take hold inside the unit. The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. In homicide investigations, time is not just a framework, it's a witness. When bodies can't speak, timestamps do. In the case of Belinda Temple, every known detail from January 11, 1999, was filtered through that lens. To understand what happened inside the Temple home that afternoon, investigators needed to do more than identify where everyone was. They had to prove when they were there and what they did with the minutes in between. By the 5th day, Harris County detectives began breaking down the Temple household timeline using all available data, phone records, eyewitness accounts, known routines, physical evidence, and discrepancies in statements. The closer they looked, the more something shifted. Not dramatically, but noticeably. A few minutes off here, an activity misremembered there. On paper, it was almost perfect, and that's what worried them. According to David Temple's initial statement, he left the house with their 3-year-old son, Evan, at approximately 3:15 p.m. to run errands, first to a grocery store, then to a park. He claimed to have returned just after 4:10 p.m. and discovered Belinda's body shortly after entering the house. He called 911 at 4:11 p.m., but the physical evidence didn't match that version. The coroner had placed Belinda's time of death between 3:20 and 3:30 p.m. Her wristwatch had stopped at exactly 3:24. The gunshot residue distribution inside the closet and the temperature of the body upon discovery supported that range, which meant she had died only a few minutes after her husband claimed to have left the house. That left an uncomfortable gap of approximately 45 minutes, from the estimated time of death to the moment of the emergency call, that had not been explained in any verifiable way. Detectives began tracing David's movements in detail. They subpoenaed store security footage from the local Kroger, where he said he stopped for milk. The timestamp on the receipt read 3:56 p.m. Surveillance showed him entering with Evan at 3:53. In the video, David appeared composed, no visible urgency, no signs of distress. He purchased one item, a gallon of milk, then exited within 4 minutes. The grocery store was less than 10 minutes from the Temple residence. Next, detectives reviewed his account of going to the park. No camera footage was available, but no witnesses came forward to confirm seeing him or Evan there that day. No photos, no joggers, no time-stamped evidence to confirm their presence in that window. The park was not far from the school where David coached, but that detail, too, added no clarity to the timeline. David's account of errands had been short on specifics. Now, under scrutiny, it was also short on corroboration. Investigators also took a closer look at Belinda's activity within that same hour. Her last outgoing phone call was logged at 2:58 p.m. to a coworker, a brief voicemail confirming a weekend event. There was no sign that she had left the house after arriving home shortly after 3 p.m. In the kitchen, her purse was on the counter. Her school ID badge and car keys were next to it. The garage door had been closed. The security panel showed no entries or exits after 3:12 p.m. The only other person known to be present that day, according to David's own statement, was him. Detectives noted a specific concern. The back patio door, where the glass panel had been shattered, showed glass fragments lying on top of a dustless mat. Not embedded, not kicked through. No trail of broken shards scattered toward the living room. The conclusion was simple. The door had been broken after the body hit the ground. Another inconsistency involved the milk. David stated he left to pick up milk because they were out, but a full, unopened gallon was already in the fridge, purchased earlier that weekend. Belinda's parents confirmed it had been delivered as part of her usual grocery run on Sunday, January 10th. It wasn't a smoking gun, but it was one more irregularity in an already collapsing timeline. As the timeline tightened, David's exact location between 3:15 and 4 p.m. remained unverifiable. Investigators considered possibilities. Was he already gone when the shot was fired? Or was the timeline he'd provided inaccurate by design? Detective Tonnett logged a note in the working case file. Too many rounded numbers. 3:15, 4:10, 3:45. None of them have proof. Memory rarely gives exacts. But he gave exacts without details. Meanwhile, the lack of physical disturbance inside the home continued to puzzle the forensic team. Burglars rarely act surgically, yet drawers were untouched, valuables unremoved, no signs of panic or haste, nothing was stolen, and no foreign fingerprints had been identified in the house beyond the expected. Belinda's fingernails were clean, no skin, no fibers, no DNA under them. Investigators processed the final detail, a faint trail of shoe impressions on the back patio leading away from the house. But the prints were partial and inconclusive. They matched the general tread of shoes owned by David Temple. But with no distinct pattern wear, they were not strong enough for conclusive forensic linkage. The garage trash can, typically lined with school materials and wrappers, had been emptied. But in the exterior bin, crime scene analysts recovered a paper towel with traces of gunshot residue. No prints were recovered from it. It had been crumpled and discarded beneath a layer of household trash. The residue was consistent with a discharge event in close proximity, though the towel's origin point could not be proven. At this point, what the team had was a timeline that functioned like a house with structural cracks. Still standing, but starting to tilt. The data didn't add up, and when it did, it added too neatly. The park trip with no witnesses, the stop for milk that was already at home, the precise memory of events during a supposed medical emergency. Investigators began asking a quieter question. Was this a failure of memory or a fabrication? In homicide investigations, motive often trails behind evidence. You first build a timeline, then isolate opportunity, then, eventually, you circle back to ask why. In the Temple case, by week 2, the timeline was unstable, the crime scene felt manufactured, and the question of why was no longer rhetorical. It was essential. And it led investigators to a woman named Heather Scott. She was 23 at the time, a young, energetic teacher who worked in the same school district as David Temple. Officially, she was a colleague. Unofficially, her name had surfaced multiple times during quiet interviews conducted among faculty and school staff. Not through accusations, through inconsistencies. Detectives learned that Heather had been seen leaving the athletic department lounge with David on multiple occasions. Private conversations, closed doors, Staff members described a closeness that had grown more noticeable during the fall semester of 1998, just months before Belinda was killed. When pressed, a few teachers said they had assumed David and Belinda were separated. No one had actually heard that confirmed. Digital forensics took center stage. Investigators subpoenaed David Temple's phone records. His call logs, pulled from landline and cell, showed multiple calls to Heather Scott, some early in the morning, others late at night, on weekends, during school hours. One call in particular stood out. January 10th, the day before the murder, 42 minutes outgoing. Heather's phone was the last known number dialed from David's line before Belinda's death. Email logs recovered from school-issued systems contained brief but revealing messages, casual, familiar, embedded with personal jokes. One message, flagged by forensic examiners, included a line that read, "I think about you more than I should." The tone shifted. The case, which had begun as a search for a masked intruder or vengeful stranger, was now reshaping into something domestic. Not based on speculation, but on traceable interactions. Detectives brought Heather Scott in for a voluntary interview. No lawyer present, no charges, just questions. She confirmed that she and David had grown close in late 1998. She admitted to phone calls, occasional lunches, and long conversations about life, family, and pressure. When asked whether the relationship had turned romantic before Belinda's death, she paused, then declined to answer in detail. But it wasn't just the relationship that mattered. It was what the existence of that relationship did to the narrative David had given police. He had presented himself as a man with no reason to hurt his wife, no arguments, no separation, no stress. But behind that version was a parallel life. Not speculation, but one with call logs, emails, and overlapping schedules. By cross-referencing faculty schedules from Alif Hastings High School, investigators determined that David and Heather had been in the same building nearly every weekday since August. Surveillance footage at a school holiday event in December showed them standing apart, but their eye contact and body language had been flagged in hindsight as unusually intimate. Nothing criminal, but not neutral either. It wasn't just about jealousy or betrayal. For detectives, the significance of the affair came down to motive and opportunity. A spouse with a hidden relationship, a life insurance policy, and a wife nearly full-term into pregnancy. It painted a picture with financial, emotional, and personal pressure points converging. And in forensics, convergence matters. Heather also made a key admission. She had not seen David the day of the murder, but spoke to him the night before. She described his voice as normal and said he mentioned Belinda was exhausted from school. She did not recall if he said anything about plans the next day, but she added a detail that changed the tone of the case files. David had asked her not to reach out for a few days. He said, "I'll call you when I can." That wasn't proof of intent, but in law enforcement, that's called consciousness of timing. As investigators dug further, they found that Heather had made a journal entry on January 13, 1999, 2 days after Belinda's death. She had written it on her school laptop, which had been backed up by the district server. The entry was simple. He says it was a break-in, but I don't know what to believe anymore. It was the first indication, even from someone close to him, that the story wasn't airtight. With that, the case file expanded to include not just who had access, but who had a reason to protect or withhold. Heather's involvement wasn't criminal, but it was contextual, and it changed how law enforcement interpreted David's behavior after the murder. Calm, methodical, legally cautious. From an investigative standpoint, the affair had now triggered the 3 essential pillars that solidify prosecutorial interest. Motive: a new relationship with a young colleague, active during the final months of Belinda's life. Behavioral shift: David had minimized or concealed this connection to law enforcement. Pre-event communication pattern: he had distanced Heather 24 hours before the crime occurred. None of this alone was enough to arrest, but together they shifted the trajectory of the investigation. And one more digital artifact confirmed the connection. On David's home desktop computer, forensics recovered a deleted browser cache containing real estate searches for 2-bedroom apartments, dated December 1998. The properties were all within 10 miles of Heather Scott's apartment complex. He had not shared this detail with anyone. Digital records had started to speak, And what they said was that this marriage, behind the front lawn and the suburban smiles, was already fractured. The truth didn't need theory. It had timestamps. By the third week of the investigation, the case had gained momentum. The inconsistencies in David Temple's timeline, the concealed affair, and the odd precision of the crime scene all pointed inward. But in real investigations, direction isn't enough. Prosecutors need more than suspicion. They need to prove that no other viable suspect exists. And in Katy, Texas, in 1999, there was one name repeatedly whispered behind closed doors: Riley Joe Sanders. Riley was a teenage neighbor, 17 years old, lived a few houses down from the Temples, known locally for cutting class, hanging with older kids, and once being caught trying to hotwire a motorcycle behind a strip mall. Not violent, but troubled, and that was enough to raise eyebrows. Early in the investigation, patrol reports noted Riley had been seen in the general area around the time of Belinda Temple's death. His movements weren't tracked by cameras. There were no timestamps, no confirmed interactions, but one neighbor recalled seeing a tall male figure walking near the Temple driveway around 3:30 p.m. Vague, nonspecific, but in a case that now had a narrow focus, any suggestion of another presence was logged. Defense investigators would later latch on to Riley's profile and attempt to build what the prosecution would call a shadow narrative. It had the basic ingredients: opportunity, proximity, and juvenile unpredictability. But it didn't hold under forensic scrutiny. Riley's house was searched. No firearms were recovered. No trace evidence linked him to the Temple home. His alibi, initially vague, was later supported by school attendance records and a brief employment log showing he'd clocked in for a short shift at a local auto shop the day Belinda was murdered. He'd arrived just after 4 p.m., still within the post-crime window, but enough to place him away from the scene when the shot was likely fired. His fingerprints were not found in the Temple residence. His DNA was not on the crime scene towel, doorframe, or closet doorknob. And no trace of gunshot residue was found in his home or on any clothing seized from his room. Still, the existence of Riley as a named person of interest, even briefly, served another function in the case. It allowed defense teams, years later, to argue reasonable doubt. But here's what didn't work about that theory. Riley had no known connection to Belinda. He had never interacted with her. There was no evidence that he had ever been inside the Temple home. No reports of threats, no record of burglary or violence. His disciplinary file at school was minor: truancy, loitering, and one in-school suspension for throwing a firecracker during lunch. Investigators reviewed his profile in detail. There was no digital trail tying him to the Temples, no phone calls, no notes, no motivation, financial or personal. It wasn't just that he wasn't a strong suspect, it was that he was never actually a suspect by law enforcement standards. But once introduced into the public sphere, particularly in the courtroom years later, Riley became something else: a hypothetical. And in criminal defense, hypothetical alternatives are sometimes all it takes to fracture jury confidence. From a law enforcement perspective, the Riley thread served as a stress test. The case against David Temple had to be airtight enough that even a fringe theory, even a neighbor with a sketchy past, couldn't poke holes in the core structure. That structure depended on timelines, behavior, motive, and forensic logic. And Riley, by every measurable standard, failed to intersect with any of it. The truth is, wrongful accusations are more than just dead leads. They leave scars. Riley Sanders would later recount how his name being dragged into the media changed how neighbors looked at him. Teachers grew distant. He transferred schools. He never returned to the street where he grew up. In stories like these, not every false lead is harmless. Some leave consequences that outlive the case itself, and that too is part of the collateral damage when suspicion enters without evidence to follow. 8 years had passed since Belinda Temple was found shot to death in her bedroom closet. In that time, forensic science had advanced, community memory had blurred, and the Temple case had shifted from an open investigation to a courtroom strategy. In 2007, the Harris County District Attorney's Office brought formal murder charges against David Temple. For the first time, the full weight of the state was positioned not behind suspicion, but prosecution. The trial took place in Houston, and it quickly became one of the most closely watched courtroom events in Texas that year. There was no murder weapon, no eyewitness, no confession. But what the prosecution had, and leaned on heavily, was circumstantial cohesion, motive, behavior, opportunity, and an implausible sequence of events that, when aligned, pointed in one direction. The core of the state's case rested on forensic logic. Belinda had been killed between 3:20 and 3:30 p.m. David Temple claimed he left the house just before that window and returned an hour later to discover the body. But video surveillance and receipt logs from a nearby store placed him in public view only after 3:53 p.m., over 20 minutes unaccounted for. The state introduced digital evidence confirming an ongoing extramarital relationship between David and Heather Scott. Phone records, emails, and calendar entries placed the affair in active motion during the final months of Belinda's pregnancy. Though not criminal, it framed motive. Prosecutors argued that David wanted to start over, without a messy divorce, financial risk, or public scrutiny. Physical evidence supported staging. The broken back door appeared to have been shattered from the inside. No valuables were stolen. Belinda's body showed no signs of defensive injury. The blast was tight range, contact shot to the rear of the head, consistent with a targeted, not chaotic act. The prosecution called over 40 witnesses, including school faculty, neighbors, first responders, and forensic analysts. The testimony built a pattern: a marriage under pressure, a timeline that didn't hold, and a behavioral profile that shifted post-crime. David was described as calm when first responders arrived, unemotional and reluctant to answer basic follow-up questions. The defense strategy focused on the absence of direct evidence. They reminded jurors that no murder weapon had been found. No physical evidence tied David to the act. No fingerprints, no blood transfer, no DNA. They also raised the earlier theory involving Riley Sanders, suggesting investigators had dismissed alternative leads too quickly. But Riley had already been cleared by law enforcement. His alibi was verified. His connection to the victim was non-existent. The defense also attempted to cast doubt on the timeline by suggesting Belinda's death could have occurred later than the coroner estimated, though that claim failed under cross-examination. The jury deliberated for several hours. On the strength of the totality of circumstances, they returned a verdict: guilty of murder. David Temple was sentenced to life in prison, but the conviction didn't close the case. In fact, it opened a new chapter, one that would eventually lead to appeals, a vacated sentence, and a retrial. At the heart of the legal battle was a claim that prosecutors had withheld exculpatory evidence during the trial. Defense attorneys alleged that documents pointing to alternate suspects or weakening key state claims had been concealed. In criminal law, this is called a Brady violation, withholding evidence favorable to the defense. It's a violation of due process, and in 2015, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals agreed. The original conviction was overturned. The Temple case had returned to uncertainty, not because of new evidence, but because the state had not played by its own rules. The community was split. Some saw the reversal as technical. Others questioned whether the wrong man had been convicted from the beginning. And for Belinda's family, it was a second kind of loss: the removal of closure they had waited nearly a decade to reach. This chapter in the Temple case didn't prove innocence or guilt. It revealed something else: how fragile justice can be when the process becomes as contested as the crime. A guilty verdict is not the end of a case, not in American courts. In some instances, it's where the real scrutiny begins. And in the case of David Temple, that scrutiny would unravel nearly a decade after his conviction. Not because of new forensic evidence, but because of how the old evidence had been handled. In 2015, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals overturned Temple's conviction. The ruling centered on prosecutorial misconduct, a Brady violation. Under U.S. constitutional law, prosecutors are obligated to disclose any evidence that may be favorable to the defense. The violation in Temple's trial involved material that had been withheld: reports, notes, and internal documents that, according to the appellate court, could have aided the defense in cross-examination or alternative theory development. Among the withheld materials was a set of early investigative notes referencing alternative suspects, including neighborhood teens like Riley Sanders. While law enforcement had long since ruled out these leads, the existence of those initial suspicions, unshared with the defense, undermined the fairness of the trial. But the Brady violation wasn't limited to names on paper. The state had also failed to disclose certain witness statements that offered conflicting timelines, including one from a local delivery worker who claimed to have seen movement inside the temple garage later than the official timeline allowed. Though the credibility of that witness was questionable, the omission was material. The appellate opinion was clear. The state's failure to disclose these details had denied Temple a fair trial. The conviction was vacated. What followed was not an exoneration, but a reset. David Temple was released on bond in December 2016. The man once sentenced to life in prison for murdering his pregnant wife now walked free, pending a new trial. From a procedural standpoint, this wasn't unprecedented. Overturned convictions happen. But in a high-profile domestic homicide case like this, the reversal sparked public confusion and division. Supporters of Belinda Temple's family viewed the decision as technical, a procedural loophole exploited to delay justice. Supporters of Temple claimed it as validation, an indication that the case had been flawed from the beginning. The Harris County District Attorney's Office, under new leadership by that point, faced a decision: retry the case or let it go. They chose to retry, but the retrial wouldn't happen right away. A complex pretrial phase followed, including extensive discovery review, motion hearings, and the re-examination of old evidence under a new legal lens. Some witnesses had moved. Others had died. Physical evidence had aged. But the core components of the original prosecution, the timeline inconsistencies, the affair, the behavioral profile, remained intact. Meanwhile, David Temple resumed life outside of prison. He returned to his home, reconnected with his family, and stayed largely out of public view. No public interviews, no statements to the press. The image of him walking free after 8 years behind bars was unsettling to many, including former investigators and Belinda's relatives, who had believed the case had been put to rest. Emotionally, the reversal created a second trauma for Belinda's family. The sense of closure they had once felt, watching a conviction handed down, was now reopened. The courtroom where they had cried during sentencing now felt like a revolving door. This phase of the Temple case highlighted a central reality in true crime. A conviction is only as strong as the system that produces it, and when the system falters, even slightly, the consequences ripple far beyond the individual on trial. The mistake wasn't whether David Temple was guilty or innocent. The mistake was that the process designed to prove it had been compromised, and when process fails, justice pauses. The retrial of David Temple began in July 2019, almost 20 years after Belinda Temple was murdered. The courtroom felt less like a place for swift justice and more like a slow-moving machine trying to catch up with the weight of 2 decades. But the atmosphere this time was markedly different. This was not the original 2007 trial, tainted by withheld evidence. This was a legally cleaner, structurally more cautious proceeding, and all eyes were watching, press, public, and prosecutors wary of another reversal. The core evidence remained largely the same. The prosecution leaned heavily on Temple's behavior following Belinda's death, his extramarital affair with Heather Scott, and the circumstantial timeline that narrowed down the opportunity. Heather once again testified. Her tone was more measured than in the original trial, but the facts stood unchanged. She and Temple had begun a romantic relationship before Belinda was killed. The defense again attempted to point suspicion toward the so-called young punks, who allegedly burglarized homes in the area at the time, but this theory remained thin, lacking names, motive, or forensic connection to the Temple house. The state this time disclosed all Brady material. Every piece of potentially exculpatory evidence was turned over, giving the defense ample room to challenge. Yet when the evidence was laid bare, the bickering over discovery technicalities faded against the starkness of motive, means, and the emotional weight of betrayal. After weeks of testimony and cross-examination, the jury reached a unanimous verdict: guilty of murder. David Temple was once again convicted of killing his wife, but the story did not end there. Despite the conviction, the sentencing phase did not proceed immediately. The same jury failed to reach a consensus on the sentence. Texas law required a unanimous decision for a life sentence or a lesser punishment. The deadlock meant the court could not issue final sentencing. Months passed, then years. The delay became nearly as infamous as the conviction itself. Between 2019 and 2023, the case lingered in legal limbo. Temple remained in custody, awaiting final sentencing while his lawyers filed motions, appeals, and procedural objections. Some argued this was a further example of a justice system weighed down by its own complexity. Others pointed to it as a sign that every accused, even those twice convicted, deserve full due process. Meanwhile, the family landscape continued to shift. Heather Scott divorced Temple during this period. Their marriage, once the center of the prosecution's narrative of motive, did not survive the second trial. Their son lived quietly, away from the headlines. Most significantly, Evan Temple, the son David shared with Belinda, was now an adult. In court records and public statements, it became clear that Evan had distanced himself from his father. He had grown up with the burden of a mother lost to violence and a father convicted for causing it. In April 2023, nearly 24 years after Belinda Temple's murder, David Temple was finally sentenced to life in prison. It was the same punishment as in 2007, but this time, the process had withstood the test of procedural scrutiny. The courtroom was quieter than in the past. Fewer cameras, less media frenzy. Justice, it seemed, had taken too long to feel dramatic. But it arrived. From a narrative standpoint, the Temple case defies the neat arc of most true crime stories. There was no shocking last-minute revelation, no hidden killer, no exoneration twist. Instead, what unfolded was a long and grinding pursuit of accountability, riddled with missteps and delayed consequences. It revealed the fragility of forensic justice when prosecution oversteps boundaries, and the incredible patience often required by surviving families. Belinda's parents had aged considerably since they first demanded justice for their daughter. Their presence in court during the sentencing was subdued. They declined to give lengthy victim impact statements. What more was left to say? The pain had long calcified into something quieter than outrage. In many ways, this final chapter is less about the man convicted and more about what remains. About a son who grew up carrying silence heavier than answers. About a system that can correct itself, but only after immense cost. About a murder that never stopped echoing, not because of its violence, but because of the time it took for the truth to solidify in the eyes of the law. There is no tidy ending. David Temple will spend the rest of his life in prison, but the damage done within families, within communities, within institutions is not so easily contained. When I think back on this case, the years lost, the pain endured, the silence that stretched far too long, I can't help but reflect on how justice isn't always swift, but it must be steady. Sometimes it's not the loudest voice that brings change, but the one that refuses to go quiet. If you take one thing from this story, let it be this: truth matters, even when it's buried under time and noise. Stand up for what's right. Speak up for those who no longer can, and don't let apathy be the legacy we leave behind. What do you think about how this case unfolded? Should justice have come sooner, or did the system do its job, just painfully late? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and let me know where you're watching from. I love hearing from you. If this story struck a chord with you, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next deep dive into real cases that still echo through our communities. And if you didn't like the video, tell me why. I want to know what you think, because your voice matters too.